Hello, I'm Brigantia Blackbird of Blackbird's Brew. Happy Friday, and welcome back to Romance in Modern Mythology. This week we're going to be examining Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester. So a little bit of basic information first. The novel Jane Eyre was published in 1847. It was written by Charlotte Bronte, but she used the pen name Currer Bell. Now, my favorite film adaptation of this story, and there have been many, but my absolute favorite is the 1997 version, in which Jane Eyre is played by Samantha Morton and Mr. Rochester is played by Ciarán Hinds. Now, the character of Jane Eyre, in very briefly, she was a penniless orphan who became a governess. Mr. Rochester was a wealthy man. He had a large country house called Thornfield, and among the other residents, besides the servants, there was a little girl who was his ward named Adele. May have been his illegitimate daughter, maybe not. He had a history with an opera singer, and she was unfaithful to him. So, there was a little bit of questioning there, but he did take care of the child nonetheless. He also had a really big secret that he kept from everybody. Not just Jane, not just the servants, but the entire world. So Jane Eyre and Mr. Rochester met after she became the governess for Adele. He was really taken and intrigued by Jane's keen intellect, and they got into the habit of having these really deep philosophical conversations. And they became quite close, and Jane did develop feelings for him, but she was always very aware of the differences of their stations, very aware of the fact that he was her employer, so she kept it very, very much to herself. Now enter Blanche Ingram. After a period of time, Mr. Rochester just took off suddenly one day, and then he brought back an entire house party. It was another family. I believe they were actually aristocracy. I think Blanche Ingram's father was Lord Ingram, but I can't remember precisely. But nevertheless, Blanche Ingram was there along with her mother and various other family members. And Mr. Rochester was flirting at Blanche quite blatantly, and poor Jane was watching all of this. Ultimately, it was revealed that this was a ruse to make Jane jealous and get her to admit that she had feelings for him, because in the usual course of things, she would never have told him, and he could not have pried that information out of her any other way. So after Jane and Mr. Rochester clear the air about the Blanche Ingram issue, Mr. Rochester proposes to Jane, she accepts, and a wedding is swiftly arranged. But lo and behold, they are at the altar when the wedding is interrupted, and there's this accusation that Mr. Rochester is already married. It turns out this accusation is coming from his brother-in-law, and he is still legally married, and he keeps his wife in the attic with a nurse to attend her because his wife is severely and violently mentally ill and has a propensity for setting things on fire. She's really very dangerous both to herself and to everyone else. Now, at the time, English law didn't permit divorce in the case of insanity. The vows in sickness and health, when it comes to mental illness, that the medical science at the time had no ability to treat or address, it was just you were stuck. And it does raise the question: at what point does having a mentally ill spouse put that spouse into the position that they're no longer able or with it enough to actually uphold the marriage vows? At what point should the other person be allowed to go free and to remarry if they so desire? It's a really complicated question, and it's one that people still sadly have to wrestle with today, even though there have been considerable advances in the understanding of mental health and how to treat it since the 1840s. But still, it happens, and it's very sad when it does. So, Mr. Rochester, he knew he couldn't get out of his first marriage, and that what made him willing to lie about the existence of his first wife. Because remember, not even the servants knew. He discovered after the wedding that his first wife was just completely bonkers, but he still brought her home to England. They'd been married in Jamaica. He still brought her home. He made sure that she was as well looked after as she possibly could be. He didn't throw her into an institution like Bedlam. He did the best he could under the circumstances, and those circumstances were pretty rotten. But he was willing to lie about this. He was willing to commit bigamy, which was a huge deal, because remember of the strong influence of Christianity and the sanctity of marriage of those times. But he did all this just to have the hope of a life with Jane. Now, after this deception is revealed, Mr. Rochester, he asks Jane if she will go traveling with him out of the countries. They can simply say that she is his wife. Who would know the difference? Essentially, it's just a piece of paper, Jane. Why can't you just come with me and why can't we just get over with? Jane's response to this is that it doesn't matter if the rest of the world isn't aware. She would know. And this is where her beautiful sense of self-respect really shines through. As much as she loves Mr. Rochester, as much as she can understand why he did what he did, as much as she feels compassion for the unfairness of his situation, she still refuses to go with him. She refuses to be his mistress. She's not going to be that person, and she ends up leaving the house. So Jane goes away as far as she humanly can, just as brokenhearted as she can possibly be, and she eventually runs out of money and she's just wandering. And after a time, she's taken in by a kindly brother and sister. Now, in the book, these people turned out to be her cousins, but in the 1997 movie, that part was dropped. Jane starts teaching at the local school, things to be going well. She's enduring. She's enduring her heartache. She's accustomed to the idea that life isn't fair and things don't always go the way that you want. I mean, think about it. She was an orphan. She was raised in this very severe school. She's had to earn her own living, which women didn't generally do at the time. So she knows how to bear her struggles with fortitude. But things are going well, and the brother of this scenario, it turns out he is a minister, and he decides that he wants to go be a missionary in India. He invites Jane to go with him, and he proposes marriage. He thinks it's just going to be the best thing ever. Jane can't bring herself to tell him yes. She knows he's a good man. She knows he would make a considerate husband, and he would hold up his end of the deal, but it just isn't right. So she ends up leaving the area because she can't stay there. And as this is happening, as she's getting this pressure from the brother and getting, this really strong go, well, you really do need to marry me. You really do need to come with me and go be a missionary's wife and all this and that. At the same time, she's feeling this absolutely overwhelming urge to go back to Mr. Rochester and find out what has become of him. She's had a terrible foreboding. She just knows something isn't right. She's even heard his voice call for her. And in the book, this is described as sympathies, or being tied together with this red cord, and it's what keeps people connected to one another even through great distances. It's a very romantic idea, but of course, pagans, we understand that that can absolutely be a very literal bond. So it gives us an idea of just how solid and how enduring the bond she has with Mr. Rochester really is. So Jane does go back to Thornfield. She discovers that there was a devastating house fire. She spoke to the local minister, the same one who was around at her about her wedding that didn't come off. He tells her that Mrs. Rochester had escaped her nurse and she set fire to the house. Mr. Rochester, he had got Adele out, he had got the servants out of harm's way, and then he went back in to get Mrs. Rochester. By this time, she had climbed up to the roof and she was dancing around the flames. She ended up falling into the fire before he could get to her, and on his way out and trying to get out, he suffered really terrible injuries, and actually this even cost him his sight. Jane tracks down where Mr. Rochester is living now, and he has quite a shock when she announces her presence. And at first, he's just overwhelmed and overjoyed, saying, "Oh, if I'm dreaming, I don't want to wake up." But he absolutely recoils when she says that, she's here, she's going to look after him, she'll be his nurse. He's like, I don't want company and I don't want a nurse. And, he doesn't desire her pity. He doesn't want her to care for him out of some sort of twisted sense of obligation. And you just hear how frustrated he says, how could he be a husband to her? How can he possibly take care of her and all these things? And again, we see Jane showing the strength of her will, and she says she's never going to leave him again. If he throws her out of the house, she's going to beat down the door. And then you have the most wonderful line that comes in the 1997 film and is actually in the book. She says, "You are not your wounds." Isn't that beautiful? She really fell in love with the inside person. That's one of the things that they discussed in one of their first conversations about how it is the inside person that is the attraction and the exterior is actually of very little consequence. And this is a beautifully mature view, especially when we have such a visual overload in our society. It's not enough to be, looking good enough and being presentable and looking respectable. People have to, reach certain standards, and then of course they can't. And, you can't live your life as if you're living inside of a Photoshop. and it makes people miserable, and it takes a terrible toll on their relationships, and they lose confidence to where they don't even pursue relationships because they're too preoccupied with external appearances. But Jane Eyre is not like that, and that's one of the reasons why I included this story in our Romance in Modern Mythology series, because I think it has such a beautiful message, because it isn't about their problems. It isn't about that, he told these ridiculous lies and got caught. It isn't about any of that. It is about the inside person, and then deciding that you are committed to that inside person. And so whenever adversity comes your way, whether it's injury or illness or anything else, you are still right there. Now, of course, it also helps that he was very much in his right mind. If he had really completely lost it, she probably would not have married him under those circumstances, because, again, it brings up the question of if someone is so severely mentally ill to where they can't tell the difference between fantasy and reality, when they can't have normal relationships of any kind, it really brings into question about whether or not they're in a position to be in a marriage to begin with. But he had his mind. As an epilogue of the story, you discover that he did eventually gain some sight in one of his eyes, and they had children, and things went well. And she finally had what she wants. She finally, after all her years of being ruthless and being isolated, she had a strong marriage. She had a strong family life. She was around people who loved her. And Mr. Rochester too. He had an opportunity to heal. He had learned from the mistakes and the foolishness of his youth. He learned how to value a woman who was actually worth having and who had good character. And he was rewarded with that nice, good family life as well. So it's beautiful. I love it. If you have a chance to watch the 1997 version or to read the book itself, I highly recommend it. If you'd like to carry on with this literary discussion and various aspects of it of the story that do relate to kind of latent psychic abilities that are sometimes woken up in the case of intense romantic entanglements, please feel free to visit me at Blackbird's Brew. I would love to go all fangirl and just gush away over these characters. But there's a link to join in the description box below, and of course, subscribe to this channel, like this video, and leave me a comment if you feel like it. And I'll see you in the next one. Bye.